Okay, so next sort of class of technique on my list is the idea of information criteria. There's a whole family of these. I'm going to focus, at least to start with, on one particular one, which is Akaike's information criterion. Very simple thing to write down and to use. So it has a very simple expression. This is it here. So the Akaike information criterion for a particular model fit to a particular data set is simply 2 times the number of model parameters minus 2 times the log likelihood of the data given the parameter values. And the idea is that we compute this information criterion for each of a set of models and then choose the model that has the minimum, or at least in the simplest usage of the AIC, you just pick the model that produces the smallest AIC. Very simple expression here if we look at it, and very directly encodes this idea of this trade-off between complexity of the model. So obviously as the model gets more complex, this increases. And so trading off that with the goodness of fit. As the goodness of fit increases, gets better, this log likelihood increases. And so, directly encodes that trade-off between the two. It almost looks like it's just been plucked out of the air to do precisely that. But interestingly, that's not the case. This formula comes from quite a complex derivation, starting with some, really quite basic conceptual ideas. Actually comes from thinking about the Kolbach-Liebler information that you lose by approximating the true generating function of the data with a model. And starting from that sort of concept, the original derivation in Akaike's original paper back in the 70s boils down to this very simple formula, which is kind of amazing, really. Actually, if you're interested in that derivation, don't go and look at this paper. Get the book by Burnham and Anderson instead, who do it in a much more sort of elegant and accessible way. They're big proponents of Akaike's information criterion and go through the derivation. It's quite an interesting thing to see, and amazing that it ends up with this simple formula. But yeah, so super simple thing to do. So you just evaluate that expression for each of the models, pick the one that's got the minimum. Possibly more familiar formula, if anyone's come across the AIC before, is this one here. This is actually a special case of the general formula on the previous slide, which is for the case where we have Gaussian noise. I'm going to show you, do a quick calculation to show you where that comes from. So actually, it comes from some quite familiar expressions that we've seen already. We've previously written down our likelihood, oops, change the color of that. Our likelihood function under the assumption of Gaussian noise. So it's this familiar old expression here. We take a big product of Gaussian functions, one for each of our measurements. So there's our general expression for the likelihood. As usual, I'm going to take the logs and turn that big product into a sum. Right, now I'm going to rearrange this slightly for reasons that will become apparent shortly, and take the sums, separate the sum over these two different terms. So first of all, this first term, of course, this first term here doesn't depend on k at all. So by doing the sum, we just get k copies of it. So I can write that as minus k over 2 And then I'm actually going to separate the log out into log 2 pi and then log sigma squared, like so. And then minus 1 over 2 sigma squared sum of square differences. Okay, and now, so one sort of crucial step in this derivation is that we use a particular estimator of the noise variance. And that particular estimator that's used is this one, 1 over k sum of square differences. So we use that as an estimate of the Gaussian noise variance. Now I'll note that it's different to the different but not massively different to the estimator that I referred to in the last section when we were talking about estimating the value of the noise standard deviation in order to do parametric bootstrap. If you remember, I referred to what's known as the unbiased estimator, this one. As an estimate of so it's not equal to that, is it? Yeah, I referred to that unbiased estimator for the noise standard deviation. But actually, there are different situations where different estimators of the noise standard deviation are appropriate. I won't get too deeply into it here, but the one that we're going to use in this derivation with the AIC for Gaussian noise is this one here. So all we do now is substitute that estimator of the noise variance into our expression for the log likelihood. So that then gives us log likelihood minus k over 2 log 2 pi minus k over 2 log of this estimator here. So that's k to the minus 1 sum of square differences. And then we've still got this term here. But actually, if you look at it, so when we substitute our estimator of sigma squared in there, the two sum of square differences, this one and this one, cancel with one another, and we're just left with minus k over 2. So then I'm going to rearrange this slightly again and just group the different terms. So that gives us minus k over 2 log mean square difference minus k over 2 log 2 pi plus 1. Okay, let's now substitute that into our general expression for the AIC, which we had on the previous slide there. So AIC equals 2n minus 2 log L. So that then gives us 2n minus 2 times all of this stuff up here. So that's going to be, okay, it becomes plus, because we've got 2 minuses there, k log k minus 1 sum ak minus sk squared plus k space log 2 pi plus 1. However, this term here, if you look at it, is just a constant. And since we're going to use the AIC to compare different models, and this constant will be the same for every single model, it tends to be dropped. So we just drop that because it's the same for all models as well and doesn't affect the choice of model that we make. So that leads us then to this expression here, which is hopefully exactly what I've got on the other slide. Okay, so that's where that comes from. And the one thing to bear in mind here is that during that derivation, we use this estimate here of the noise standard deviation. And that's important because it means that we've effectively estimated one more parameter than just the parameters of the main model that we're interested in evaluating. And we have to account for that in this number n. So that's what the last bullet point here is saying. This number n of model parameters has to include the standard deviation. So it would be the number of parameters of the model plus 1, because we've also made this additional parameter estimate here. Okay, again, I sort of demonstrate that when I'm using the AIC on that climate change data in the demonstration video. Okay, let me see, where are we? 10:51. So I think we can just about get to the end of this AIC section. One advantage immediately that we can see over the F-test of using the AIC, I've made no mention of models having to be nested, and we don't have to have nested models to use the AIC. We can compare different kinds of models with completely different sets of parameters, and don't have that same limitation that we have with the F-test. There's another advantage. So although the simplest mode of usage of the AIC is kind of, as I said at the start, we just evaluate the AIC for each of, I candidate models and pick the one that has the smallest. But there's another really useful mode of usage, which expresses the relative likelihood of each of those models. And it does that through this idea of Akaike weights. Once we've got calculated AICs for each of our set of candidates, we can then derive a set of weights which are defined by those AICs. So it's simply the weighting for one particular model is the exponent of the difference of its AIC with the minimum AIC over the set divided by 2, and that gives a weighting for that particular model. And then by doing that, we can then use the relative likelihoods of each of those models to make predictions or express or parameter estimates that are influenced by multiple models. And so this is sort of a general idea of multi-model inference. And this Burnham and Anderson book that I pointed to earlier is, although it's a proponent of the AIC, it's particularly a proponent of this idea of multi-model inference, where you combine information from multiple models to get more robust kind of consensus estimates of particular parameters. Again, I go through this in detail in the video, but just very briefly, suppose that we had estimated our fiber direction n hat from the diffusion tensor, and in fitting the diffusion tensor to a particular data set, we had identified an AIC, I don't know, of something, come back to fill a number in a second. And then we do the same process, but now using the ball and stick model. So not nested, but that's fine because we're using the AIC. So we get these two estimates of the fiber direction, one from the diffusion tensor, one from the ball and stick model. And I can then calculate also the AICs of those two models. So I won't actually write down specific numbers for them, but having got those, let's suppose that the AIC for the diffusion tensor is less than the one for the ball and stick. So I can then calculate these Akaike weights for each of my two models. So I can get an Akaike weight for the diffusion tensor, which is the minimum AIC, that's the AIC of the diffusion tensor, minus the AIC for this particular model, that's also the AIC of the diffusion tensor. So their difference is 0, meaning that the Akaike weight is e to the 0, which is 1. So Akaike weight for the model with the minimum AIC is just 1, whereas anything that's got a higher ADC will give us an Akaike weight which is slightly less than 1, e to the some negative number. So let's suppose that we get a, I don't know, a number for the ball and stick of something like 0.8. So it's only slightly less good fit to the data than the diffusion tensor, but nevertheless, it gets a slightly less AIC and thus a slightly lower weight. So then we can use those Akaike weights to provide a combined or consensus estimate of our parameter of interest here, the fiber direction, by combining them just according to those weights. So we might then write the fiber direction, the consensus fiber direction would be Akaike weight from diffusion tensor times its estimate plus Akaike weight from ball and stick times its estimate. Then we'd have to sort of renormalize it, first of all, because the weights don't add up to 1, but actually, even if they did, we need a unit vector here anyway, so we have to renormalize. Okay, but the point is we combine those estimates to get, weighted by the sort of relative likelihood expressed by these Akaike weights to get a consensus estimate. And often that can produce much more robust estimates than you get from any individual model, particularly in situations where there's uncertainty about which model is the best explanation of the data. Just to summarize then on the AIC, so advantages over the F-test, we can derive the AIC for any noise model, but we do have to assume a noise model. And we're no longer tied to this necessity of having models that are nested, which is nice. One kind of point about its usage. So the original AIC was actually derived on the assumption that the number of measurements tends to infinity in comparison to the number of parameters in the model. And obviously that's not normally the situation, but there were later adjustments to the AIC that add this pretty simple term to the end, which makes it more appropriate for a finite ratio of measurements to model parameters. And the sort of assumption, the recommendation that various books on this technique give are that you should always add this adjustment if that ratio is less than 40. I mean, so we should really have used it in the example that I've just showed you. And in fact, if you think about it, you might as well just always use this adjustment, because it's very, it's a very simple adaptation to the formula. It doesn't cost you anything computationally, and so you may as well just always use it. So there are various other criteria that work in a very similar way to the AIC. Another popular one is the BIC, Bayesian Information Criterion. Once again, directly encodes this trade-off between complexity here and goodness of fit. This time, rather than 2n, we've got n log k, where k is the number of measurements. But basically works in the same way. So quite interesting that it comes up with this very similar formula, whereas actually the starting point for the derivation of this, the BIC, is really quite different to that for the AIC, and the derivation is different, very different set of arguments, but ultimately leads us to something very, very similar, which is quite interesting. Okay, and then there are various other criteria, all interestingly, like the BIC, end up with a very similar form to the AIC, but all starting from quite different starting points and ideas, but all ending up with a very simple expression of the trade-off between complexity and goodness of fit. Quite interesting that they all end up with approximately the same formula.